the Battle of Cold Harbor, which is kind of the bloodiest, I think is probably one of the really bloody battles of the campaign. So what
Yeah,
happens is Lee is able to finally recover, and he's ready to face Grant. Lee intends to do a final showdown at Cold Harbor. Grant was able to get strategic positioning around Cold Harbor, and what Lee plans is to commit Longstreet's Corps now under Anderson to attack at first light. And Longstreet's Corps, even though Longstreet's no longer in command, it was kind of Lee's last really aggressive, trained offensive unit. And his plan was to kind of hit Grant in the morning. Grant orders night marches and gets reinforcements to Sheridan around Cold Harbor. And around Cold Harbor. And you got to understand, let me rephrase a little bit. So Bethesda Church and Cold Harbor are kind of connected almost. They're a couple miles apart, and it's kind of this long, continuous front. So Bethesda Church is at one side, Cold Harbor is at the other. And the Union position is very weak. So Grant orders a bunch of units to Sheridan and some other leaders, and they prepare to defend while Grant brings his whole force up. So Lee is really comfortable with this terrain. It's a home turf. He won a decisive victory here during the 7 Days campaign. And what happens is the first day of the battle, Lee orders this attack, and the attack is uncoordinated and kind of breaks down immediately. Now Commander of Longstreet's Corps, Anderson, orders a reconnaissance in force with a garrison unit of their own, the 20th South Carolina, which was a fresh unit, which is very rare this late in the war, that had 12,000 men in a regiment. So they kind of march forward to attack Sheridan. And what Sheridan does is he dismounts his cavalry. And because they have repeating rifles, he is able to just shred this division. Just completely shred it. And what they do is, instead of they kind of get in position behind cover and rocks and trees, and they just kind of just mow down this division, and like some of the officers watching it, they said they never saw an army so quickly demoralized. Union soldiers, this would really help the Union out, because the soldiers that were kind of flooding into this area to help Sheridan out were kind of lost between, they had two Cold Harbors, Old Cold Harbor and New Cold Harbor. And ironically enough, none of these are close to any body of water. It's just the name. So eventually, Sheridan's able to hold. And by 10 a.m., the Confederates attack again. It's utterly failed. The repeating rifles win the day, and reinforcements come in to save Sheridan. Anderson retreats, pulling his units back to a defensive position near Pickett's division, and the Confederates start doing what they do best, particularly during the Overland campaign. They start digging in. Lee started marching his men around Cold Harbor, and he starts digging in. And what happens is Grant is really frustrated because, once again, Lee is there. He has met Grant on the field, and Lee is digging in. Meade suggests a frontal assault with some fresh DC garrisons that would be seeing their baptism of fire, and they plan this big frontal assault at 5 o'clock. So what happens is these fresh units, they have barely any training, but what Grant says is he doesn't care. That doesn't matter. You're just going to march forward in this line, and you're going to stab them with the bayonet. So what happens is this attack begins at 5 with these fresh DC units, and they push forward to this Confederate line. And what happens is they see some initial success. They take a couple rifle pits. They can collect a couple prisoners. But what happens is that they immediately get attacked. They counterattacked, and these units become pinned down as Confederate forces kind of attack these DC garrison troops marching towards the Confederate fortifications. It kind of becomes a maelstrom of, just as we've seen repeatedly throughout the campaign, death and destruction. So what happens is Meade gets frustrated with Grant, and they all start getting really worried because these attacks are failing, and it's getting really publicized. Like, they're really worried that this is not going to look good politically during this attack, because it's failing, and they see it's failing. but they're still committing forward kind of in hope that'll work. But eventually, the divisions are repulsed, and the Confederates win day one once again. Lee kind of loses faith in Anderson because he kind of failed to be as decisive during the battle, and he demanded too much of reinforcements, and he just wasn't as decisive as Lee hoped. And what happened was Lee had to start pulling forces out of the Shenandoah Valley to Cold Harbor to kind of check Grant because they were kind of the Confederates were running dangerously low on manpower. On the second day, Grant issued orders to postpone attack because it was really hot out the next day. It was really like sticky, and he knew the attack would, fail, and people would die of heat stroke before they, met a wall of lead. Lee attempts a couple probing actions that fail, and then it finally rains that night, which was perfect for everybody. On day 3, on the night of day 2 and the beginning of day 3, Lee sends his engineers out, and they go out on this mission to kind of really perfect the kill boxes that they had, these redoubts, these defenses, these trenches, whatever you will call them. He decides to perfect them. So what he does is he redesigns these trenches so they're mathematically, I guess to the trajectory of musket fire and cannon fire, and they're built to such a outstanding level that they're kind of just these huge like kill boxes where the Confederates just have to sit in these trenches and just pick at these soldiers. And it's really, I guess, a marvel of engineering on the Confederate side. So at dawn, Grant orders a frontal assault across the line all at once from Bethesda Church to Cold Harbor. These newly formed regiments, they are really unexperienced, and they kind of just march forward, and thousands of men just attack all at once. And once again, they see, they take a little bit of ground, but then are repulsed. And these attacks just suddenly just start thrown backwards. The Union melts. There's one account of this flag bearer. He was marching with his regiment, and the regiment and he's a young guy, like I think he's like a kid, and he's marching forward, and he gets to the Confederate Confederate trenches, and he stops. And they realize that he's the only one left in his division, and he's just holding the flag. So the Confederate soldiers, they stop shooting, and they tell him to just go around. You're like, just go home. We won't kill you. So what the kid does is he bows and he walks away. And he's the only one still alive out of his whole regiment. Like, it's really, really crazy stuff. And during this fighting, Lee isn't really in command. He is sitting on top of a hill watching the battle. And because this battle is so close to D.C., a lot of forces come to a lot of senators, congressmen. Yeah, Richmond, my mistake. They come forward to see the battle. And what Lee does is he's like, I need reinforcements, and this is why. And all these leaders in the Confederate government watch this onslaught. The Confederate casualties during this battle are remarkably low. And this kind of,
the Confederates turned defensive.
Yeah.
As Grant said, I always regretted the second attack on Cold Harbor. This attack was futile. It was just sending men into the meat grinder yet again. But this time, it was much bloodier than before.
Yeah. And there was I believe it.
For the rest of his life, it's not like he didn't care for his soldiers or was heartless. He did, but he thought this was the only way to win the war. But even he knew that this was a very bloody and a horrible way to fight a war, a necessary way to win a victory.
Yeah. So what happens is, there's almost a no man's land that develops, and what Grant's staff does is they start hiding casualty reports from the newspapers because they're afraid that it's going to start a riot in D.C., and particularly during this election season. So it's about 5,000 wounded and killed on both sides, and then through the 4th through 12th, they Grant and Lee kind of talk of a ceasefire to collect the dead, but it was kind of like a pride moment because Grant didn't want it to be called like a ceasefire because he thought it would be dishonorable. He wanted or a truce. He didn't want it to be called that in its proper terms. He wanted it to be called like an exchanging of like the dead or something. And Lee's like, get out of here. Like, that's weird. You know, like if you want to do a ceasefire, we could do a ceasefire and collect the dead. But it's just really bloody stuff, you know. And this Confederate soldier jokes that says that Grant is trying to stink us out because of how like nasty the smell got. Like it's really morbid stuff, you know. And there's like inconclusive skirmishing between the lines, and a lot of manpower is drained on the Union side. So another more conscripts are called up, you know, and a lot of old Union divisions are starting to disband, you know. But eventually something's worked out, and men on both sides, you know, they start collecting the bodies, and they start like trading knives for some reason, knives and coffee. That's what they do. They go out, they meet each other, and they just start trading knives and coffee.
Huh.
Which is weird. You want some coffee? Well, I got a knife. Okay.
I got a sharp knife and a coffee right here.
I thought it was weird, but they were able to. It's interesting how they, even after such a bloody battle, they were able to, I guess, approach each other. Because I bet the Union soldiers were just really mad. Just all campaign season, just getting just eviscerated. You know. What happens is Sheridan heads up to the Shenandoah Valley, and Lee has to counter, and he has to move more divisions to the Shenandoah Valley, which is what he didn't want. You know, he sends Jubal Early, you know, to the Shenandoah Valley to drive out Union forces, and is hoping to kind of draw some men away from Grant, which doesn't really happen. Grant decides that he is done with with Cold Harbor, and he decides to move to this railway hub in Virginia, Petersburg. So he decides to move to Petersburg, and Lee is kind of waiting in position. They kind of pounce Lee when he's starting to move his army away. But what Grant does is he kind of is able to trick Lee and disappear into the night, and Lee wakes up and Grant's army's gone. And this was one of the few times Lee's staff had seen Lee visibly like livid. Like he was freaking, he lost his mind. Like he was like red in the face, freaking out, you know. And the overland campaign ends just like that, and the siege of Petersburg begins. So yeah, that's about it.